Okay, welcome back everyone to part 2 of our Chapter 10 lecture on intelligence, terrorism, and the U.S. Constitution. Now, if you recall, we left off speaking about the Balancing Act and kind of an introduction to some of the issues for modern intelligence. Well, now we're going to look directly at some of these different things that we're doing. So, increasingly after the events of 9/11, local law enforcement agencies have taken on greater roles in domestic anti-terrorism. And as we discussed a little bit in Chapter 9, fusion centers have become norm in some of the large cities, along with joint task forces composed of local, state, and federal law enforcement officers that regularly work together to identify and arrest terror suspects. Now, nowhere, however, has local law enforcement been more active in preventing terrorism than that of New York City. So the city basically bore the brunt of the 9/11 attacks and remains a place of huge symbolic importance in the American psyche. And as such, the city has confronted its vulnerability to terrorism attacks by basically preparing and an unprecedented response in the form of proactive and intelligence-led policing that yields a specific police counterterrorism unit within the city of New York PD. So basically, in 2002, the New York City Police Department developed a sophisticated unit that can respond by land, sea, and air as a first line of defense against terrorist attacks. And it did this because really it did not want to rely on federal agencies in case of a future attack, but it also does not have any external oversight, if that makes any sense. So, I mean, you have to kind of think about that. So they created their own group, and that's great. And they didn't want to just rely on federal agencies because we know that there were some mistakes made, etc. But yet there's very limited oversight. Typically, the example is it functions largely at the discretion of the police commissioner in New York and the mayor of New York City. Now, in addition, this unit deploys local NYPD police personnel overseas. So it even kind of goes a little bit further than just patrolling in their own cities. And I have a couple of pictures of their counterterrorism unit. So again, it deploys local NYPD police personnel overseas to foreign countries without the formal sanctions of diplomatic recognition through the U.S. Department of State. So that kind of is interesting, right? Now, NYPD officers are commonly observed at the scene of terrorist strikes throughout the United States and around the world, collecting information and providing relevant intelligence back to NYPD commanders. And as such, NYPD's counterterrorism unit has sometimes been accused of violating the Constitution and overstepping its bounds on more than one occasion. So these are, kind of interesting times. It's great to be in the know, but should they have their own local unit overseas without any type of diplomatic backing, if you will? And I have a quick video on the terrorism unit there on the link below. But so, for example, it was revealed in 2011 that the unit had been secretly monitoring the Muslim community extensively over a decade, conducting surveillance in mosques and even sending out officers to act as what they call rakers or crawlers within the Muslim community, essentially serving as part of a kind of a human mapping program within not only New York City, but also the entire United States. So, you have to kind of ask yourselves, is that something that we should be doing? Or is it something that we shouldn't be doing? And there's good and bad on both sides, right? Now, clearly NYPD officers are out of their jurisdiction when they're operating outside of the confines of New York City. The NYPD used its diverse force of officers again to infiltrate ethnic neighborhoods in a number of other East Coast cities, going undercover to monitor individuals at bookstores and markets and restaurants and religious centers. And there was no criminal predicate, and the only variable for being a target of surveillance was in fact being a Muslim. So again, we have to kind of look at it. Are these questionable things that they're doing? So the unit, as I said, they developed a team of informants known as mosque crawlers who reported to their NYPD handler on routine religious activities, an undertaking that would blatantly violate constitutional and other legal protections against collecting intelligence on purely First Amendment activities had a federal agency been involved. So again, there's two sides to the coin. So is it an effective tool to go out there and gather intelligence and have informants and secretly immerse individuals into different groups? Yeah, it is. But where's the line is all I'm trying to get across to you. And that's why we're talking about, intelligence, terrorism, and the Constitution, trying to put all of these things together. So now we want to kind of shift gears a little bit and look towards the military a little. So now we're going to talk about the military and the policing functions and something that's called posse comitatus, but maybe not the same way that you think it is. So local and state police departments are not the only entities that have found it difficult to balance their activities after 9/11. Similar to law enforcement, U.S. military forces have increasingly found themselves participating in domestic intelligence and security operations, a role that has been historically illegal. The Posse Comitatus Act was passed by Congress in 1878 as a reaction to the events that took place during the post-Civil War Reconstruction era. And it basically says that no branch of the military could be used in a policing action within a state. Now, the Patriot Act expanded the ability of the military to assist with domestic intelligence and security, and challenged this Posse Comitatus Act, right? So, again, these are all kind of interesting things for us to look at. So the Posse Comitatus Act became law and set forth the provision that federal troops could not be used in a policing action within the state. We talked about that. And it says, no branch of the military could be used as a posse comitatus or otherwise execute the laws of a state, except in cases and under circumstances expressly authorized by the Constitution or acts of Congress. So what is posse comitatus? Again, just so we can kind of get the definition down. It's a term meaning literally power of the country, and it refers to the military's role in enforcing state or civilian law. So the USA Patriot Act expanded the ability of the military to assist with domestic intelligence and security after 9/11. And again, as I said, it challenged the validity of the Posse Comitatus Act in our modern history. Now, further, the USA Patriot Act created the new U.S. Department of Homeland Security. That's kind of where it came from. After the Patriot Act was formed, we now have the Department of Homeland Security. And we'll talk about that quite a bit, in more detail in chapters 12 and 13. Now, it also created the new U.S. Northern Command called NORTHCOM. And NORTHCOM is a military command responsible for the entire northern American continent, plus the Caribbean Basin, or Caribbean Basin, depending upon how you want it to be said. And we could probably debate that one all day. It's also responsible for protecting all U.S. borders and U.S. coastal waters up to 500 nautical miles from land. Now, NORTHCOM's purpose is to support local and state authorities in the case of a domestic terror attack or even a natural catastrophe. So it's also tasked with prevention, deterrence, and response to external threats of security of the United States. So again, that's NORTHCOM and their responsibility. So one of the examples that we can cite here or look at that NORTHCOM assisted with would be Hurricane Katrina. So they were directly involved in that. And you can read a little bit more on NORTHCOM if you want on page 281 of your textbook. Now we're going to kind of look at another thing that's starting to develop a little bit more, and we're seeing more of it. And that would be drones, or the use of domestic drones. And to give you a couple pictures of different drones. Some are used by SWAT teams. Police departments are using them for quite a few different things, but they're also used in the military. And by definition, a drone is an unmanned aircraft that can navigate autonomously. So the use of domestic drones as a means to collect intelligence, information, etc., is kind of a hot button topic in the United States. And this is especially true considering that the use of domestic drones by law enforcement is basically posed to dramatically increase. And we've seen that. And drones, again, are unmanned, aerial vehicles that are widely used for the purposes of both commercial and governmental endeavors, including the monitoring and surveilling of commercial property, the scientific and academic research of geography and space, the surveillance of private and public transportation systems, and a host of intelligence gathering operations, from crowd control monitoring to border enforcement to routine law enforcement and security monitoring operations. So there's just a lot of different things. Now, we've talked about some of the things that they can use for or be used for, but the technology used in drones is also evolving. One manufacturer has produced a device equipped with a 1.8 gigapixel resolution camera that is capable of the high resolution monitoring and recording of entire cities, and pictures of individuals, people, can then be analyzed by computer systems using high-speed visual recognition software and databases of known terror suspects and wanted persons. Additionally, the listening capability of drones has also dramatically improved. It is now possible to listen to and record normal conversations between individuals inside of a house, a building, or an office, simply by having a drone hover nearby. Now, you're probably thinking, at least I was when I first heard this, I'm like, dang, that's pretty cool. But are we infringing a little bit on the Fourth Amendment? But on the other side, are there times when, when we're in the middle of a terrorist investigation that maybe we have to? So again, I ask you, where's the line, right? So, drones, again, are becoming more and more popular among domestic law enforcement agencies, those regular, like, police and sheriff. And police drones are used to, assist in locating bombs, finding lost children, monitoring weather, traffic, and even wildlife patterns, and rescuing people during natural disasters. And most, agencies also use the drones to assist in deploying personnel during emergencies, as well as to assist in monitoring existing problems during critical incidents, maybe even fires or earthquakes, etc. So, for the most part, drones are not practical for large-scale surveillance operations. But, again, the camera systems and the listening devices, etc., have shown that they can be an interesting tool as it relates to, intelligence gathering. Now, a recent survey showed that about 1/3 of Americans fear the potential of domestic drones to spy on their daily activities. And in response to that, the ACLU has recommended that drone usage be subject to, some safeguards, if you will. The usage limits, meaning, drones should be deployed by law enforcement, only with a warrant in an emergency, or when there are specific articulatable facts that believe that the drone will collect evidence relating to criminal activity. So, meaning, like, you need to have a reason, not just flying it around. Data retention. The images should be retained only when there is reasonable suspicion that they contain evidence to a crime or they're used for an ongoing investigation. Policy. Usage policy on domestic drones should be decided by the public's the representatives, not by police departments. And the policy should really be clearly written and open to the public. Abuse prevention and accountability, meaning the use of domestic drones should be subject to open audits and proper oversight. But what if you're using them for terrorism surveillance or investigation? Do you want the public to get a hold of all that? So all of these questions. And then finally, weapons. Domestic drones should not be equipped with lethal or non-lethal weapons. Well, I can tell you, at our police department, we had a drone that was equipped where it could fire either a shotgun round, a beanbag round, and even a taser. And 2 of those items were considered non-lethal. But there was a reason for it. So, again, all these interesting things, right? So, controversies about the use of drones really kind of bleeds over, if you will, into the military. So there's also been much controversy about the use of drones to carry out military type strikes against combatants on foreign soil. And drones have been a key weapon in the fight against Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State in Pakistan, Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan, and even Somalia. And these drones differ greatly from the ones previously discussed relating to domestic law enforcement use, the kind of small ones, or the even larger ones. And the larger ones, these are militarized or weaponized drones, capable of firing missiles at targets or crashing into their targets with explosives. And we'll look a little bit more about that, as when we get to chapter 14, when we talk about counterterrorism. So just kind of, consider these aspects again as it relates to the Bill of Rights, etc. And then what about intelligence and torture? And if you click on the link there, it'll take you to a couple of videos if you don't know what waterboarding looks like or is. So the 9/11 attacks produced a series of unforeseeable events. The desire to strike back at terrorists was predictable, but the authorization of a new set of harsh or enhanced interrogation techniques really wasn't predictable at first. The new methods were at odds with American values, our Constitution, and case law, and the Third Geneva Convention from 1949 that in part requires prisoners of war to be humanely treated and protected, particularly against acts of violence, intimidation, and insults, etc. Now, enhanced interrogation techniques were also contrary to a 1994 United Nations international agreement signed by the United States that prohibited, as a matter of human rights, torture and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. However, all of these authorities were kind of brushed aside in the pursuit of terrorists or terrorism. So, illustratively, if you will, in 2002, our government concluded that captured terrorists were not entitled to the same protection of being prisoners of war because they were enemy combatants, and we'll define that in a few. And part of the underlying logic was that because there was no declared war, there could really be no POWs. So that's kind of interesting, right? So the use of these, extreme interrogation techniques is not a simple case of a few agents kind of going rogue, right? They were used globally, and the American governmental apparatus was substantially involved in approving these new methods, and their use was not just for a handful of isolated cases. Now, a small bipartisan group of the congressional members were briefed on these enhanced techniques by the CIA with no dissent about the methods. The U.S. Attorney General's office approved them, as did the Secretary of Defense. Now, moreover, it is also clear that the White House supported these new measures, or they could not have been implemented. Now, again, this is kind of an interesting thing, and there's a cool exercise, and I think you're going to actually write about it. I'm trying to think. It's called the ticking time bomb scenario, and I think it's one of your case studies. But that's kind of where we're at when we're talking about intelligence and torture. Now, in retrospectively looking at the record, it is arguably true that on the issue of intelligence and torture, that for a time America kind of lost its way. And some people, groups, and institutions may readily endorse this conclusion, while others may say that, this is naive and doesn't give sufficient weight to the urgent necessity of gathering potentially life-saving intelligence. Now, the latter view does give rise to larger questions, such as, do the ends justify the means? And even if an action is legal, must it be also moral? That's another good question. How reliable is the evidence obtained by coercion? Is there a natural and unavoidable clash between individual rights and protection of the homeland? So, it is essential to note that many of the activities now labeled as torture were enhanced interrogation techniques previously approved by our government as counter-resistance measures and legally permissible under existing guidelines. And I want to talk to you just about the three levels, if you will, or categories of techniques. So, category one, and this would be, during the initial interrogation, if the detainee should be, provided a chair, in a generally comfortable environment. If cooperative, you'd give him cookies or cigarettes. If uncooperative, it authorized, yelling at the person, the use of deception, multiple interrogation techniques, maybe even leading the detainee to believe that the interrogator is from a country with a reputation for harsh treatment. So that's kind of category 1. So that's kind of the lowest one. And then category 2, the use of stress positions, such as standing for 4 hours, the use of falsified documents or reports, isolation for up to 30 days, use of other than standard interrogation techniques. So the use of hoods over their heads while being transported and interrogated, 20-hour interrogations, no comfort items, taking them all away, including religious items, reducing rations to standard military like MREs, those nasty things. And I don't know, some of you, maybe you like those. Removal of clothing, forced grooming, meaning shaving facial hair when maybe religiously you're supposed to keep it, right? Or using detainee phobias to induce stress like claustrophobia, or fear of dogs or snakes, etc. So that was category 2. And then category 3 would be, within the military prior to the approval by a general grade of, officer was required to use category 3 techniques. Now, such techniques include the use of scenarios to convince the person that death or severe pain consequences were imminent for either the detainee or their family, exposure to cold weather or water. So, even things like, waterboarding, and that's kind of, if you don't know what that is, it's to induce the misperception of suffocation, kind of like drowning, different things like that. So these would be like category 3. So, again, it is really easy to conclude that criticisms of these enhanced interrogation techniques emerged only after the emergency climate created by 9/11 faded. However, it is more likely that as the secrecy surrounding these techniques was peeled away and these actions reported, opposition to them emerged. And in 2004, the United States Army released the Taguba Report, basically an investigation of alleged abuses and accountability lapses at a U.S. prison in Iraq that found numerous incidents of wanton abuse. And in 2013, the task force released its report, which found that the U.S. government had, in fact, engaged in the widespread use of sanctioned torture of detainees and suspected terrorists after 9/11, including some American citizens. And the report describes interrogations of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay and other detention facilities controlled by the CIA, which included things like extreme sleep deprivation, waterboarding, chaining of prisoners to walls in different positions, slamming prisoners into walls or floors, or even exposing prisoners to long periods of nudity and even humiliation. So, again, are some of these necessary or not? And these are all things for us to kind of consider as we go through this chapter, and how much of these bleed over into now the Eighth Amendment, right? When we talk about cruel and unusual punishment. And if you don't know what the Eighth Amendment says, then this would be a great time for you to maybe take a break and read it. But let's continue on. So in 2014, a report by the U.S. Senate Intelligence Commission concluded that the CIA had intentionally misled Congress and the public about the success of the interrogation program. And the CIA had described the program to both the U.S. Department of Justice as well as Congress as basically retrieving unique and otherwise unobtainable intelligence that helped disrupt terrorist plots and saved thousands of American lives, both domestically and throughout the Middle East, including areas like Yemen, Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And this representation, it may not have actually been accurate. There are findings that the information gained from torture is often unreliable, despite such claims, popular belief, and even media representation to the contrary. So again, this just makes us think, should we use some of these techniques in certain circumstances? And we're talking about Homeland Security, or are we stepping over the line into that Eighth Amendment area? So now let's look at something called the Military Commissions Act. So the U.S. Patriot Act of 2001, and we know what that is, and the Military Commissions Act of 2006 combine to provide exemptions to granting detainees constitutional protections. So the MCA, that we're going to call it, the Military Commissions Act, allowed the president to determine who is an enemy combatant. Being labeled as such dispenses or gets rid of the U.S. government's obligation to provide the protections of the Fifth and the Eighth Amendment. Therefore, an enemy combatant detainee can be held indefinitely without being charged. The MCA also allows enemy combatants to be subjected to the extraordinary interrogation methods. The U.S. Department of Justice also has ruled that the Fifth and the Eighth Amendments do not apply to foreign enemy combatants held abroad, and that even U.S. citizens are subject to the designation of an enemy combatant when captured abroad. So by definition, the Military Commissions Act of 2006, this was an act of Congress signed by George W. Bush in 2006 to authorize basically trial by military commission for violations of the law of war and for other purpose. And it prohibited detainees who had been classified as these enemy combatants or who were awaiting hearings for their status. They have no challenge to the amendments that we talked about. So there's no challenge to their detention. And an enemy combatant, by definition, a special designation of a person who has engaged in hostilities against the United States or its coalition partners. And I have a video if you want to look at the Jose Padilla case. Okay, so now let's kind of finish up with a couple of interesting things. We're going to talk about leaks in security, and then we'll finish up with a little bit of internet stuff. So in 2010, a series of intelligence leaks by the U.S. military personnel and contractors rocked American perceptions of intelligence and privacy, and basically laid bare or showed shocking details related to nearly every facet of American intelligence gathering. Intelligence leaks really have occurred throughout history, but in the past several years, it has become obvious that technology now enables those inclined to gather and leak classified material to do so in large quantities and to gain widespread exposure and attention to those materials that they have obtained. Because technology is great, right? So the use of things like, flash drives, thumb drives, etc., allows these spies to kind of quickly and surreptitiously copy massive amounts of information. In the past, such gathering of mass data would have been really cumbersome and really obvious to people around you. Now, there's an interesting case. In the case of basically Chelsea Manning, and we're going to call this person Bradley Chelsea Manning for right now, but we'll go with Chelsea. So Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden. No one was even aware of their actions or their access to copying of mass information that was related to national security until it kind of hit the news. Nobody knew that they did it. Now, in the case of Chelsea Manning, was the first major exposure of United States intelligence secrets and wartime tactics since World War II. The Army private, which was Manning, was deployed to Iraq in 2009, and by 2010, she had surreptitiously downloaded hundreds of thousands of classified military documents onto a CD while passing the media off as a Lady Gaga record. So, she was basically telling everybody, no, it's a Lady Gaga record, when really it was a CD of files. And those documents were later passed on to WikiLeaks, a non-profit international organization that claimed to be dedicated to publishing classified documents in the name of transparency. And the classified items that Manning stole and subsequently leaked included video. It also had some war logs in there. It had State Department diplomatic cables, meaning information, communications, if you will. And it also had several Guantanamo documents. So, this was just a lot of information. Now, the effects of Manning's leaks were wide-ranging from a number of different perspectives. First, U.S. officials blamed her for putting a number of diplomatic relationships on ice, particularly those involving the governments of Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. And second, government officials who testified against her in 2013 blamed the leaks for harming military relationships with Afghan villagers and for straining operational relationships with the Pakistan and Afghan governments. Now, accordingly, these strained operational relationships endangered the lives of foreign citizens who worked with the U.S. diplomats and for hampering the efforts of the U.S. Department of State to work with human rights groups overseas. And the United States also claimed that the leaks put the lives of U.S. soldiers and citizens at risk as they basically inflamed terrorist rhetoric. Now, there was not too much evidence to really support that part. Now, regardless, Manning was charged with 22 offenses related to the leaked documents, and she pled guilty to 10 of those 22 offenses and was found guilty in a military court of all but one of the remaining charges. And she was sentenced to 35 years confinement in a maximum security federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas. And she was, however, acquitted of the charge of aiding the enemy, which could have carried a death sentence. So, got herself into a little bit of trouble. So that's the case of Manning. And then in another leak, if you will, so beginning in June of 2013, a series of leaks to news organizations, including the British newspaper The Guardian and the Washington Post, began to surface that detailed orders from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court that we talked about in this chapter towards the beginning. And the court order basically required Verizon to hand over telephone metadata to the National Security Agency. Under a secret program entitled PRISM, the leaks revealed that a total of 9 internet service companies were being forced to give the NSA broad access to audio and video chats, photographs, emails, documents, and connection logs of suspected foreign terror targets. And this information allowed the NSA to document, trace, and conduct further surveillance on these individuals. And one day after these initial leaks, it was further revealed that the U.S. government had developed a specific program called the Boundless Informant Program that listed these individuals as well as their targets for offensive cyber attacks. So Boundless Informant is a real-time global surveillance tracker that details and maps by country the metadata it receives from computer and telephone networks. And the leaked information about the Boundless Informant revealed a surprising statistic that the NSA had collected 3 billion pieces of information in just one 30-day period. That was March of 2013. From U.S. citizens alone, and 97 billion records from individuals worldwide. Now, this really was a surprising development, right? Particularly since the NSA had long maintained to Congress and the American public that it was not technologically, it wasn't feasible to track, record, or analyze such abstract intelligence data, and that such programs did not exist within the agency. Well, to cap things off, okay, and here's kind of an example of what PRISM looks like, and then I'll finish up. So again, we have the, PRISM. We talked about that secret program. We know what the Boundless Informant is, but here's PRISM. And these were dates when PRISM collection began for each one of the different providers. And you can see the list of providers that are there. So, to cap off the series of leaks, in June of 2013, the identity of this individual who leaked everything was revealed as a 29-year-old former NSA and CIA information technology security contractor by the name of Edward Snowden. And comments about his leaks indicated that he was well aware of the consequences of his actions. And he basically said in a statement, "I understand that I will be made to suffer for my actions, but I will be satisfied if the Federation of Secret Law, unequal pardon, and irresistible executive powers that rule the world that I love are revealed even for an instant." So Snowden basically asserted that his case was a little different than that of Manning, who basically copied all that information. According, to him, to Snowden, he carefully evaluated every document disclosed to ensure that each one was a legitimate interest to the public, and that there were, many other documents that he could have leaked, but he chose not to. So in his words, his intention wasn't to harm people, but rather to provide some transparency to U.S., about or to the U.S. government. So, kind of interesting. Now, the leaks showed that the U.S. did spy on other countries and their diplomats. And Snowden currently resides in Russia on political asylum, and he hopes that he is seen as more of a whistleblower than a traitor. So the question is, is he guilty of treason by all of the information that he supplied? Or is he just someone that's basically showing us that here's what the government is doing? And treason, if you don't know, just by definition, you kind of think about this and we'll be done. Is he guilty of treason? The crime of betraying one's country. Okay? The action of betraying someone or something, typically your country. So, treason is a kind of a disloyalty crime, typically to the state or the country. Yeah, so is he guilty of that? Oh, and by the way, treason, the penalty for that could be death. So, think about that as well. But anyway, is he guilty of treason, or is he just guilty of showing the world of what some of our intelligence agencies are capable of? Okay, so that's it. A lot of detail, a lot of definitions, a lot of information. Thanks for hanging with me. I appreciate it. But that will conclude our Chapter 10 lecture on intelligence, terrorism, and the U.S.